We acknowledge that this event is taking place upon the traditional territories, the territories of the Haudenosaunee of the Six Nations Confederacy, the Anishinaabe peoples of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, and before them the Chinantan Nation, called the Neutral by the French, and the Attawandaron by the surrounding nations. These people are the original caretakers, the peoples that lived on and intimately worked with these lands. We acknowledge that we have a responsibility to know and understand their heritage. The treaty that was signed for this territory is the Between the Lakes Treaty, No. 3 of 1792, and further the deed referred to as the Haldimand Proclamation of 1784, which applies to the land 6 miles on either side of the Grand River, from the mouth to its source. We need to be aware of our role in these documents. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples upon this land. We acknowledge that we have an obligation to learn to live wisely together on this land.
Hello, welcome to the first installment of the 2021-2022 speaker series here at the Brant Historical Society. My name is Lillia Dockree. I'm a recent graduate of the history program at Laurier, Brantford, and I'm also the Seniors Outreach Coordinator here at the museum. Tonight I'll be presenting on one generation's experience in 2 pandemics, a comparative study between the polio epidemics in the 1930s and 50s and the COVID pandemic today. I worked on this research project with fellow students Tyler Britz, Dolores Mass, and Steve Parr, and we were supervised by Dr. Tara Brookfield. So what I hope to share with you in my presentation tonight is a bit about our project, like how we got started, a brief history of polio in Ontario, and then I'll share a few stories of the interviewees that we were able to speak to with our project, and their experiences with polio and their memories of public health measures during the 1950s. So with the worldwide onset of COVID-19 in March 2020, it awoke a public interest in understanding how Canadians confronted past pandemics. We were inspired to compare the similarities between the scourge of polio in the decades leading up to the 1955 discovery of the Salk vaccine and the onset of COVID in 2020. We discovered many similarities. Both public health crises were shaped by uncertainty and fear. Attempts to contain each virus were made via school closures, quarantines of those sick or suspected to be ill, and advice about the merits of hand washing. Wild guesses were made at the causes of each infection, and hope for a cure and a vaccine ran deep in both eras. Another connection between the 2 pandemics is how the last generation to experience widespread polio in Canada are now in the age group deemed most at risk for COVID today. Our research opportunity was generously funded through the Race Family Undergraduate Research Apprenticeship Program at Laurier, Brantford, and the collection of expositor articles on microfilm at the Brantford Public Library were invaluable to our research. So our project started going through primary and secondary documents relating to the histories of polio, pandemics in general, and just a general history of Brantford. It was a little different conducting research during COVID, as we were not able to largely meet in person. So we held seminar-style Zoom calls between us 4 students and Dr. Brookfield on a regular basis to connect and share our research. So once our background research was complete, it was time for the interview stage. This started with an application to the Research Ethics Board, which was approved, and then we put out a call for participants in the expositor. We were looking for people who either had polio in the 1930s or 1950s, or people who just remembered the time period, and then connected via email. And everyone was very flexible in terms of maneuvering communication as we weren't able to meet in person. And it's a really big thing to call a stranger on the phone or over Zoom and tell them your life story. So we're very grateful for the participants that were still willing to be a part of our study, even though it was mostly online. So polio is a disabling disease caused by the poliovirus. And symptoms typically last 2 to 5 days and can include a sore throat, fever, tiredness, headache, and stomach pain. A small percentage of polio patients develop more serious symptoms affecting the brain and the spinal cord, and these symptoms can transform into paresthesia, meningitis, paralysis, or weakness in the arms, legs, or both. And paralysis is the most severe symptom associated with polio and can lead to permanent disability and death. And today there are 2 vaccines that can prevent polio, and it's nearly eradicated across the entire globe. And the image on the right-hand side of your screen is a statement by the Ontario Department of Health on polio, and this was printed in local newspapers across the province, and it would list the symptoms and preventative measures that one should take against polio to hopefully prevent catching it. So polio existed in outbreaks around the world for millennia, but didn't become an epidemic until the 20th century, helped, ironically, by improvements in sanitation. Poliovirus enters the body through the mouth via food, water, or unwashed hands that are contaminated with the infected fecal matter. Until the 19th century, almost all children would have come in contact with poliovirus before the age of 1, while they still enjoyed protection from maternal antibodies transferred from the mother to baby during pregnancy. However, as sanitation improved, and children are less likely to come in contact with poliovirus as babies, when they encountered it as older children, their immune systems were unprepared. And until the discovery of a vaccine in 1955, there were resurgences of polio across Canada almost every summer, with major outbreaks in Ontario in 1937, 1953, and 1978. So in the image on the left-hand side of the screen, the top left here and lower right is Dr. John Hugh of Preston, Ontario, spraying the nasal passages of district children with a zinc sulfate solution to guard against infection. And use of this spray was based upon belief that the infection might be contracted through the nose or through the throat, and the treatment generally was administered by a physician. And then in the lower left and top right is pictured a child encased in a huge drinker machine, or the iron lung, at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. The machine was proved effective in continuing respiration and saving the lives of patients whose lungs were attacked by paralysis. And the machine, by pumping and withdrawing air at a governed rate of speed, supplied artificial respiration to the patient. And polio still does exist, although polio cases have decreased by over 99% since 1988, from an estimated more than 350,000 cases to 22 reported cases in 2017. This reduction is the result of a global effort to eradicate the disease, and today there are only 2 countries in the world that have never stopped transmission of polio, and this is Pakistan and Afghanistan. So with iron lungs, the idea of an external negative pressure ventilation can be traced all the way back to the 1670s, but the first machine to be widely used was the drinker respirator in 1928. And as the 1930s epidemic began, only one of these machines existed in Canada, and it was in use at the Hospital for Sick Children in Toronto. While more were needed, doctors and engineers at the hospital built a version out of plywood and an experimental respirator for premature children. While commercial iron lungs were available, they could not be delivered in time. So over a 6-week period, the hospital assembled 27 of their own machines in the basement, and these were paid for by the province and shipped wherever they were needed to go. During the first major outbreak in the summer and fall of 1937, 2,500 cases of polio were reported in Ontario, causing 119 deaths. In an attempt to stop the spread of polio, towns and cities across southwestern Ontario delayed openings of multiple school boards. Swimming pools, movie theaters, and other public spaces were also closed in order to limit the spread. And around this time, a nasal spray to prevent polio was being tested in the United States. Canadian scientist Dr. Maurice Brody explained to the American Public Health Association that, quote, While the spray was effective in protecting laboratory monkeys, results were not encouraging as far as human beings were concerned." Unquote. By 1953, polio season was an ingrained part of every summer and early fall. The Brantford Expositor tracked each case by location, age group, and severity of symptoms. In 1953, the Brant County Health Unit reported 16 cases by September. 13 of those cases were children under 12, and 10 involved paralysis. In the image on the left-hand side of the screen, we can see local insurance brokers Bunnell and Hitchon trying to temper the fear of polio by selling polio insurance to individuals and families. 1955 was a major year in the fight against polio. The Salk vaccine that had been in development for years was proven to work, and later that year, the vaccine was administered to school children in Brantford. A few interviewees remember the momentous occasion of getting the vaccine for themselves. While widespread vaccinations ended an annual threat of polio, a resurgence occurred in 1978 that was imported from the Netherlands. In Norwich County, members of the Netherlands Reformed Congregation, a religious sect that opposed inoculations, contracted the illness from Dutch visitors. 6 local people were confirmed to have contracted polio in August of 1978, and a total of 90 people were quarantined. Nearby Brantford became the center of a new wave of immunizations, and according to the Brant County Annual Report for 1978, the total number of vaccination doses distributed was 46,197, which 20,545 were distributed at the Brant County Health Unit clinics. Stephanie Sterling was born in 1942 in Brantford. At the age of 5, she contracted polio after a tonsillectomy, and she was sent to the Children's Hospital in Hamilton for treatment. She remembers treatments involving scalding rags placed on the polio-afflicted appendages. One of the biggest things that Stephanie remembers is being alone in the hospital without her parents. The medical staff kept her in the dark about a lot of what went on in terms of her health and the polio diagnosis and treatment. She noted that they did a lumbar puncture on her, and the next day sent her to Hamilton to be quarantined. She was one of the youngest children in the ward of roughly 20, and her parents could only come to visit through the window. After her initial struggle with polio, Stephanie's recovery lasted until her early teens. When her bones stopped growing, in order to prevent further malformation, she had to have her toe and part of her foot fused. This resulted in one foot being smaller than the other. And in the image on the left, you can see Stephanie in her cast after the surgery. And she did not let polio adversely affect her life. She overcame its detriments through willpower and strength, playing many different sports as a child and as a teenager. And she later went on to become an operating room nurse. Marion Stratford was born on August 24, 1935, and raised in Brantford on a farm on Cockshutt Road. Her family were dairy farmers, and she carried on with that tradition, remaining in Brant County throughout her life. Marion contracted paralytic polio quite suddenly when she was 12 years old, and it was not known how or when she contracted the virus, but one day at school in 1947, she began to feel unwell and her teacher sent her home, and Marion rode her bike home on her own. She noted that, quote, "The next morning I went to get up and I couldn't, and my dad had to carry me down the steps. They took me to the Brantford General and I had this spinal tap. And I guess that clinched the fact that I had polio. They sent me down to Hamilton to the polio center, and that's where I was for 5 months and 2 weeks. They told me when I got there that I'd never walk again because I was paralyzed from the waist down," unquote. She was placed on a ward and left alone until the hospital staff discovered that she could move her toes, and this promoted them to using the Sister Kenny treatment on Marion, which was a combination of heat and muscle stretching. She remembered that they didn't put casts on at all. Before you got the exercises, they would put you in a hot tub of water. It didn't scald you or anything, but it was pretty close. Then they put hot packs around your body from your toes right up to your neck, and then plastic went around that, and then wool around that. It stayed on until it got cold. Then somebody came along and took it off, and then they exercised. By then the muscles were softened up a bit. It had to stretch the muscles back out, and it hurt, but if you were determined to walk again, you let them do it. The Sister Kenny treatment was controversial in the medical community. She was not a doctor and did not have medical evidence to support her claims. However, her success allowed it to become a common treatment, with clinics opening up over the United States. Marion's mother continued the Sister Kenny treatment at home, and Marion was able to walk again with the use of crutches just before high school. Marion's strong will and determination came from the desire and the belief that she would not picture herself laying in a bed or sitting in a wheelchair, and she refused to allow polio to stop her life. She married when she was 21 to her husband of 61 years, and they had 3 children. She and her husband worked on their own farm and owned a store in Scotland, Ontario. And today, Marion is facing post-polio syndrome and is losing leg muscle, but she still doesn't allow it to control her life. And she lives with her son and daughter-in-law in Oakland. Sylvia was born in a very small village in Germany in 1947. She was able to walk early as an infant, and her parents knew that something was wrong one morning when she was unable to stand on her legs and had a high fever. She was sent to the hospital immediately, and for the next 2 years of her life, without any contact from her family at all, she underwent treatment for paralytic polio. Her treatment began with being placed in casts from her waist to her toes for months in a row, until research showed that movement and exercises were better for paralyzed muscles. Her stay at the hospital was very isolating and lonely. She was not allowed to receive any visitors at all for her entire 2 years of hospitalization. She was in a very large ward with 30 to 40 kids in cribs. Her parents received letters of her progress. Once the hospital felt they did all they could for Sylvia, she was sent home to her family, who at that point were virtual strangers. Sylvia continued regular checkups every 2 or 3 months. Her family doctor, the village church, and the community provided a lot of support to her family. Quote, "We were only allowed to have one toy, and when we left the hospital, that toy would be destroyed, for fears of others catching the disease." 1948 was shortly after World War II, when there were almost no doctors or nurses. One was lucky to find a doctor or a nurse, and they would be paid little, if paid anything. Unquote. Sylvia counts her family's support as part of her strength. They would not send her to a special school, so she went to high school with all the other students. And although it was difficult, she dealt with it. She did not let polio hold her back, and she immigrated to Canada with her family as refugees from Poland when she was 21. Today, she lives in Paris, and she worked until she was 68 as a translator and has been married for 40 years and has 1 daughter and 1 son. Like many of our participants, Sylvia continues her battle with post-polio syndrome, a serious consequence that starts decades after the original onset of paralytic polio and includes spinal damage, pain, and difficulty breathing. Sylvia walks with a walker and continues to fight this disease today with support from her family. Andy was born in Brandon, Manitoba in 1946, and while he never contracted polio himself, he recalls how mothers in his neighborhood were worried about the disease. On his walk to school, he would see houses with a quarantine sign on their door, not only due to polio, but other childhood diseases like diphtheria. In 1952, he was part of a group of school children who participated in a clinical trial for the Salk vaccine. Everyone was thrilled when the vaccine trials were proven to work. The downside for Andy was discovering he had only received a placebo vaccine as part of the trial and therefore had to get vaccinated again in 1955, this time for real. He noted, quote, "I was mad because I was in the control group and had to get all the needles all over again. But the fact is, we did lick polio, and it left us with a bit of optimism once it was finished," unquote. Before the vaccine was approved, a childhood friend of his contracted polio, and Andy recalled that when he got back out of the hospital, he had a very severe limp and lived with this limp all his life because of the polio, one of the side effects of it. So he was the one that I probably have the most memory of, but there were others. We became very close friends and we often walked to school together. I remember him talking about how frightening the iron lung was, the machine that they put the kids in to help them breathe. What a frightening experience, but he made it. He survived. Another personal connection Andy had to polio was his sister-in-law, who worked as a nurse at the hospital in Brandon. Part of her job was to escort children who had contracted polio from Brandon to the hospital in Winnipeg, a 2.5-hour drive away. H.V. Viv Nels was born in Paris in 1942. And like Andy, he did not contract polio himself, but he recalled the panic surrounding polio season. Quote, "The threat of polio was sort of constantly in the air. Like nuclear war, it could break out at any time. We were constantly conscious of the threat of polio. Bombs are going off in Nevada and in the Pacific Islands. It could easily be the end of the world. But the world didn't end, and we didn't have any nuclear holocaust, and the same with polio. It was out there, and it was perfectly clear people were getting it, but I wasn't getting it, and no one in my family was getting it. Nobody that I knew was getting it, but that didn't make it less scary." Unquote. As a rural kid in Paris, he was taught not to go into certain bodies of water during the summer. But being kids, they of course did not listen, and places like the local Rest Acres swimming hole remained popular. Viv also recalled local fundraising efforts on behalf of the March of Dimes, the Canadian charity which collected donations to assist families impacted by polio and support vaccine research. We put a double-sided masking tape along the curb along the main street of Paris. Both sides. Parking was banned during this time, and people came to stick a dime on the sticky tape. The whole incentive was trying to fill an entire tape with dimes on both sides of the street. The March of Dimes was a very prominent organizer. Now, Viv is recently retired as a professor of history with an illustrious career at many universities. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a winner of the Tyrrell Medal for Historical Scholarship, and a 2-time recipient of the Sir John A. Macdonald Prize in Canadian History. Ruth was born in 1934. She lived with her brother, mother, and grandmother in Waterford until she was 18. While she would go on to train as a nurse, her first experiences with healthcare occurred during the Great Depression, when home remedies were often the only accessible option. And polio was not the only threat during her childhood. Ruth recalls a 6-week quarantine in isolation from her family when she contracted scarlet fever. Quote, "There were big cardboard signs on the door to say that our house was under quarantine. My mother and my brother moved out and went across the street and boarded with our neighbors. Because they could not come in and out of the house, my mother still had to go to work to earn a living, and my brother had to go to school. So, with me at home, my grandmother looked after me." Unquote. She earned her Master's of Health Administration at the University of Toronto and has worked in public health for over 30 years. Starting as a Victorian Order nurse, she taught at the University of Toronto before coming to the Brant County Health Unit as a public health nurse, then supervisor, then director of nursing. And during her stint as director, Ruth worked through the 1978 outbreak of polio in southwestern Ontario, when approximately 90 people were quarantined. She helped organize immunizations for thousands of people in Brant and the surrounding region, and it was a frantic time with long lineups and a low supply of doses. She noted, "It was all hands to the pump, because there was this sudden surge of immunize as many people as you possibly can, and it was at that point that I really fully realized how little attention people paid to the whole business of being protected against disease. People, more than half, 3/4 of them, basically thought that probably they had some needles, when they were a kid, but they weren't sure. They certainly had no idea what they were. When the 1978 outbreak was at its peak, people were coming to the health unit for polio shots. They were lining up, not just at the back door of the health unit, but up the hill, all down Terrace Hill, down the other side, right around the health unit itself. We were doing everything we could. We had extra people helping to give the vaccine, and then we were running short. So you might be wondering, what is post-polio syndrome? So only people who have had polio can get post-polio syndrome. But having post-polio syndrome doesn't mean that you have polio again. Post-polio syndrome doesn't spread from person to person. Roughly 31,000 Canadians live with the effects of polio today, and post-polio syndrome can appear anywhere between 15 and 50 years after the initial polio diagnosis. Some of the main symptoms include new muscle weakness, fatigue, and muscle and joint pain. And treatments for post-polio often include exercise, physio, and medication. And the March of Dimes, which I mentioned before, also runs post-polio support systems. So they meet on a regular basis and are almost networking groups and support groups for people with post-polio syndrome. So at the end of our interviews, we asked our participants to reflect on living through the COVID-19 pandemic and compare living through polio and living through COVID. And a few of their responses are listed here. Sylvia noted that my husband and I feel it is important for us that we follow the rules set out. And then from what my parents told me from way back when, the rules were very similar. And they felt the same way about it, that they needed to abide by those rules and to keep the virus at bay. When I think of COVID now, it is somewhat similar to polio in that nobody knew what to do. It kind of came all of a sudden and then kept coming back. Oh, thank you for listening all the way through my presentation. If you're curious to learn more about the history of polio in Canada, there's a few links here on the side that would be able to help you out. And if you have any questions about my presentation at all, please send me an email. My email is listed above, and it's also on the Brant Historical Society website. Thanks for joining us.